So, hi Julia. Thanks for being flexible around the debrief time. I know 8 o'clock in the morning is not the ideal time to debrief, but like with testing, quite honestly, it was the only time that we can squeeze it in. So I really, really appreciate it.
Right.
Okay, so I was able to send you like notes from my debrief yesterday and like our instructional practice guide that we usually use. Were you able to look over that?
Yeah, I looked over it, and I'm actually really excited to talk about it because I felt really good about the lesson, so I wanted feedback on it to see like, if my perception was correct, but it looks like it was, so I'm good. I'm glad.
Yeah, there were a lot of strengths, and I want to jump right in and talk about those. So I think like one of the things that we had spent some time talking about in the past is like your work on core action one and really being thoughtful around the text you're pulling for students. And when I say thoughtful, I'm talking about like, is it rigorous? Is it on grade level? Is the text like a quality text? And yesterday's lesson was a strong example of you hitting like all of those indicators on core action one. And I think the evidence from that would have been like your students' participation in the lesson. Like it was a lesson where like students were able to like easily engage. The visuals were strong. The questions that were built in the text and the ones that you like built in the text yourselves were also like really strong examples, and the quality of the text really allowed you to do that. So it was a strong example of like what a whole instruction text should have looked like. I also wanted to shout you out for, I know in our last debrief we talked a lot about like student participation. And when I was here a few weeks ago, there were about like 4 or 5 students who like consistently had their hands raised, and you were calling on those 4 or 5 students. You were like, someone's hands up, let me call on you. And yesterday you had 22 kids, and 18 of those kids raised their hand at least once. In that lesson yesterday. So I want you to tell me like what are some things that like have changed in your practice in the last 3 weeks to see that huge jump in like student participation and like the diversity of student voice and who's sharing in your classroom.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've done and incorporated into my planning and just my lessons in general is like more of them and less of me, in the sense of allowing them to communicate with each other or communicate like solo through like writing or just timing of thought, so that they can produce my exemplar responses. I feel like before I was like nervous that they wouldn't say anything, or like nervous that they would say the wrong thing, and now with the like the stop and jot and the turn and talks and that writing before they're speaking, I'm able to give like all my students, regardless of their level, like the opportunity to collect their thoughts before they turn and talk to someone else, or turn and talk or bring it back to a whole group. So that's one thing that I think that is really, really been working when it comes to like my whole group discussion.
Yeah, and I think like one thing you're hitting on with all of those strategies is like you're giving students like wait time. So it's either you're waiting till you see more hands up, or you're literally saying before you share, I want you to wait and like write down your ideas. I want you to wait and think about it. One strategy I want you to add is what's happening now is that there were still like 4 or 5 students who didn't raise their hand at all. And there were some questions where everyone could have participated in those questions. So when you get in those situations, I actually want you to say something like, so I know 100% of us can answer this question. Take 30 seconds and go back to your notes. So instead of just waiting, you're now giving them a strategy. And they know that like, okay, Ms. Cruz is now going to like hold me accountable for participating, and she's not going to let me opt out because everyone else is participating. Okay?
Yeah.
So I want you to try that, and then we can touch base and like see how that is going. And again, it's just going to be like another way to hold all of your students accountable. But I want to push us to think specifically with your strong text yesterday, the objective and the standard that you were measuring. And how do you know that 100% of your students hit the goal of cite and textual evidence, specifically on ideas that were implied from the text?
Yeah, so I think one of my biggest ways was obviously afterwards, because I do my closed reading worksheets with my stop and turn and talks. I collect those to see what their individual thoughts were, but also being able to walk around and hear them talk to their partners, engage in, jump in a small group conversation, and then of course when they came back to whole group, being able to kind of note as I'm going through my lesson who's on target, who has a thought that's misplaced, and then how can I direct that when we come back to the whole group setting.
Great. So with the checks for understanding that you mentioned, so like the turn and talks, the stop and jots, were you tracking that data anywhere during your lesson?
Not formally during the lesson, no.
Okay. So even though you weren't writing this down, informally, what ways were you collecting data?
Informally, I would just note participation of like who's raising their hand, who was able to answer a question, and kind of like the type of question they were able to answer. So during a turn and talk, were they actually participating? Were they doing just more of the listening? Were they vocal? Like, who was the first person to speak? Who really felt confident about their answer? And then, of course, afterwards, when I look at the sheets, being able to see, like, okay, when no one else is looking, what is your thought? What did you put down on paper? That kind of thing.
So that is some like really strong informal data. So when you're like looking around the room when they are writing their stop and jot, so like overhearing their turn and talk questions and their answers, are you using that information to then decide who do you call on next? So are you using that information to decide what does my next check for understanding question look like or sound like?
Yeah. In this lesson, I really didn't, because the kids really, really engage with the text. They really love drama. They love reading aloud. As you saw, they get very into character. So this wasn't one of those lessons where I felt like I had to pull teeth. But I'm sure, like, if I had felt like we just were totally off base or we just missed something that I really need the kids to get, then, and I noticed that in a small conversation, I probably would have pulled it. But I know I did maybe once, like, I saw somebody who had a really strong written response that I wanted them to share. But I don't think in the moment I was really kind of make those decisions because we moved so smoothly. Like, had it not moved smoothly, I probably would have had to make those kind of decisions. But it seems to go well.
Yeah, I think one thing that you're hitting on is that like this was a lesson that was like engaging in many ways. I think like some of your teaching practice have improved to make this lesson engaging. The text was strong. The pacing of the lesson was really well, so it allowed for a lot of student participation. But when we zoom in and be like even more critical of who was participating, and what types of questions. So when you think about like when you asked your most rigorous questions, the questions that were most aligned to actually measuring the standard, were there any trends that you noticed in like students who participated?
Not off the top of my head, I don't think I noticed a trend.
Yeah. So yesterday in your lesson, Julia, your most rigorous questions, so there were like the pre-questions that you asked, the post-questions, but your most rigorous questions actually came between the scenes, where you had like students reflect specifically on a small detail that happened in the text, and then like what were the implications of that, or like where did they see that detail actually beginning to be built earlier in the text. So when you think of like those most rigorous questions, who are your students who were able to participate and answer those questions?
Isis, definitely. Kyle, and Nina and Brandon.
Okay, so let's think about those. Let's stop there and let's think about those for kids. So when you think about those for students, is there anything that those for students have in common, whether it's like the way they participate in class, academically, where they are, how they've grown, anything like that?
So Nina and Brandon are very similar. So they're all some of my higher level kids now. Okay. The difference would be Isis and Kyle have always been my high level students. Whereas in Nina and Brandon have worked their way. They were like my mid-range, on grade level, teetering, on 6, and now they're they made great grades on their iReady, their SLO data, their map. They're making the growth, and they're able to now participate on that higher level. They have good discussion techniques. They're able to articulate themselves and then take other things from others. So like read, write, and then discuss kind of thing. So I guess that would be a similarity between them. Now I've thought about it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of similarities and a lot of like really high level similarities that want to allow those students to participate well in class, and they have like the skills particularly to like do well on those standards. So I actually wanted to dig deeper into the implications of only calling on students who raise their hand and like not being super strategic with your checks for understanding, because that allowed you to call on those 4 students for the higher level questions because you weren't strategically thinking about who you were calling on at certain aspects of the lesson. So one thing that I noticed throughout your lesson yesterday, Julia, was that all of your questions were largely whole group. Outside of the like turn and talk or the stop and jots, the rest of the questions of like figuring out like, are we ready to move forward? Well, you were depending wholly on whole group questions. And the only kids that then were accountable for like mastering that content, or that you knew what mastering that content, were the kids who then shared out loud. So I actually want to zoom in because you did share a little bit about one trend that you noticed was that this was happening with your higher level readers. So I want us to actually zoom back and like talk about your lower level readers. So does specifically talk about your lower level readers in this debrief feel like a good use of time for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the class I observed yesterday, who were your lowest level readers? Because I want to actually ground this in specific kids.
Richard, Jonathan, John and Jose.
Okay. So when we talk about Richard, John, and Jose, How were they specifically engaging in yesterday's lesson? And then, like, are there any, like, again, similarities in the way that were able to engage in lessons even outside of yesterday?
So they're all ELLs. Two of them are newcomers, so their like English is extremely low. John is a little higher in his English. He's been here longer. His spoken English is perfectly fine at this point, but written English is still something he's working on. So they were able to participate in the turn and talks and the stop and jots because they could do that in their own language. But when we would come to whole group, they necessarily either, I won't say can't do it because I know that they can if I structure it, but like more so their confidence level to be able to answer a whole group was probably not there, and the rigor of questions sometimes probably went a little beyond their scope in terms of what they could grasp. So I noticed that they were able to participate, they were engaged, they were focused, they read along, but I didn't get the whole group participation that I would have wanted. To get that, then check for understanding of like, okay, they've got it. I kind of just had to make the assumption that they got it because they weren't like saying I don't get it, but they didn't necessarily say they got it either.
Yeah, so like one thing I wanted to push for, and that I want you to have a tool as a teacher, is to not be working off assumptions. So the clarity that you are able to speak to about your 4 highest level learners that you highlighted and like what they understood and what they didn't understand, I want you to be able to say the same things about Richard, John, and Jose. So what that's going to mean in order for you to do that is that you're going to have to have built into your lesson plans instructional strategies that reach all of your students. And whole level Cheryl is not a strategy that's going to work for every single one of your students, right? And then how are you using that data that you're collecting throughout the lesson to be really strategic about who you follow up with and then how you follow up with them. So when we think about your lesson that you planned yesterday, if you were to make it even more stronger about building in instructional strategies that targeted specific students, so like targeted your ELL learners, for example, how would that have made yesterday like a more effective day for everyone?
I mean, I would have been able to get more data on more students, not just the students that raise their hands. And then it would allow me to see kind of where my kids maybe, I don't know how to say, but like almost see kind of like where they fall off track.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I'm aware of. I want to try to use more things like a randomizer or a name wheel so that obviously I'm not going to force a kid to answer. Like if they literally look at me with like, I have no idea what you're saying, like that's also data for me too, because then that lets me know that they might not be that type of kid, or they, you know, to touch base with them and be like, okay, so what about that moment was a little frustrating for you and why do you feel like you couldn't participate? But it would definitely allow me to just get way more data on kids that I would need more data on, because of my higher kids, like I can get data from them because they're going to participate, but I might not be able to get that info data from students that aren't as local.
Yeah, so like you shared, being able to have like more data, more accurate data on students, understanding where their content knowledge is actually breaking down, and then being able to like not have to make assumptions about their understanding, because that's going to allow you to have more strategic conversations with them and more strategic conversations with their family around like how can they support them in their learning. And this is especially important for your ELL learners who they have to get additional support outside of the classroom if they're going to like meet their goals.
And that's data that I can also give my ESOL team too, to work with them. Like, hey, these are things that I noticed. Can you cover this when you're doing pull out, or can you cover this when you're working with them as well?
Yeah, so it seems like we're on board of saying like, so this is something that we can like concretely zoom into making better. So let's consider what this could have looked like yesterday.
Okay.
So I can think about this in 3 parts. I think like planning is one thing that needs to happen, like the tracking in the class, and like how do you use that in the moment. So let's start with like what is 100% in your control, and that's the planning piece.
Right.
So what are some things that you could have done in your plans to target 100% of your students before the lesson even started?
I think that goes to like my questioning maybe, and working with how I build my questions, what kind of questions I'm asking, and where I put them in my lesson. So specifically the whole group.
Yeah, exactly. So when you say how you build your questions, tell me a little bit more about what you mean.
Like maybe with the scaffolding of like working from a lower question and then having that medium question so that we can do what we just said, like, so I can see where the knowledge, I can see where the knowledge gap is. So like if I have my like standard whole group questions I know everybody can answer regardless, like is the sky blue? Yes, those kind of questions. And then build the rigor so that I'm seeing like if a kid can't answer the question, this is where they fall off. And then maybe having, I guess that's where maybe I would lean on you more to say like after I notice that point, either to have a question to fall back on or take the data and like make some instructional shifts in the moment.
Yes, exactly. So let's zoom into that. So the way I imagine this happening is that when you're building out your checks for understanding, the places in your lessons that you're asking questions are smart places. What I now want you to do is think through, instead of asking 3 questions that's during my check for understanding time, I actually want you to ask 2 lower level questions, 2 mid level questions, 2 high level questions, right? And have those questions already scripted into your lesson plans. So that's going to hit am I actually chunking and having questions and check for understandings built into my lessons that I think are going to hit all of my learners and where I anticipate them being. What I also want to push you though to do is also track that. So for example, when you are teaching and you have like the notes from your lesson or like your lesson plan on a clipboard, when you ask your mid-level question and someone gets that incorrectly, I want you to like write their name near that question. So then even though you're not like giving them like exit ticket or some assessment during the lesson, you literally have now a place written down that's going to remind you that John was not able to answer this mid-level question. When we go to our next break for check understandings, I'm going to ask him a lower level question. I'm going to strategically now ask him a lower level question to see if he's able to answer that question.
That feels good to me.
Yeah, so like how would being able to like do that help you, and then following up with John later in the lesson?